Hello, here we are again. Today it is chapter 14. Let's go. Alright. After speaking with Papa, I retired to the Huntsman's Oak and found Emma there fiddling with her camera obscura. Her red hair and elfin features gave her the appearance of a pixie in a child's primer, but the look upon her face was full of more determination than a flighty fairy could display. When she noticed my slight limp, she set aside her device and invited me to sit with her. "Mamma has not diminished your enthusiasm?" I said, dipping my chin towards the little brown box. "Not in the slightest," she replied, "but I'll need to find a new source of silvered plates. She's instructed Beatrice to count the set at the end of the day and lock the cupboard." "Perhaps Mr. Blackwood has a few spare silver plates in the kitchens of Northwich," I said. "He doesn't strike me as the kind of man to host frequent dinner parties." She laughed. "I think he did a fine job of hosting a dance, if you ask my opinion." Her care of my ankle had done much to restore my abilities, and we sat on the branch together as she administered her final treatment, running her fingers lightly over the injured area. The swelling was gone, the pain reduced to a dull ache. Truly, as Papa proclaimed, the world is full of marvels. My youngest sister is one of them. "You spent a great deal of time with Mr. Marsh last night," I said. She glanced up at me with a blush on her cheeks. "Did I? I suppose I did. Do you think it was improper? I doubt anyone noticed." But her smile was cheeky, and she avoided my gaze. "I'm sure a few of the local men felt their noses to be bent out of joint," I added. "After all, they were waiting for you to notice them, but you spent all your time in the company of one of the soldiers, and an outsider to boot." "No. Were they angry?" "Oh, Harry, you tease me," she laughed. I ignored no one. Her eyes gleamed. "But isn't he handsome?" I shrugged. "If a uniform is to your taste." "Jane was so good to sit with Frederick Darling and keep him company," she continued, bowing her head once more to her work, circling her fingers over my leg. "It mustn't have been easy for him to socialize, with the fate of his brother still unknown. A very dutiful fellow, don't you think?" Then she paused and looked up at me with an impish grin and said, "Mary tells me you were discovered by the pond in the company of a certain gentleman, and that same gentleman called upon you this morning, and goodness, won't tongues start wagging?" "I don't hear any tongues waggling but yours," I replied. Emma lurched forward. "Well, has he expressed interest?" "In me? No, most certainly not." She looked disappointed and skeptical. "You and Mr. Blackwood would make a very lovely couple." "Oh, God, now you're teasing me," I said. "No, I have no intentions on that man. He is a bully and a selfish curmudgeon, and he assumes the worst of people. I smiled as I looked off in the direction of the northern forests. "I think my heart belongs to another." Emma's fingers stopped abruptly. "What?" Then, gathering her wits, she said, "Wait a minute. Who would be of interest to you?" But instead of answering, I said, "You've done a wonderful job with my ankle, Emma. You're so gifted. We really are fortunate to have you." I swung my legs down and stood in the driveway, testing my weight upon my foot. Suddenly I thought of last night, with kisses running up and down those naked legs from 1,000 suckers, and the pleasure of drowning in those delightful sensations, a mingling touch and desires shared between two creatures in an endless loop, back and forth, and my pulse quickened just a fraction. "No, you will not ignore me, Harriet Philomena Lovecraft," she insisted, batting my shoulder with one small fist and interrupting my train of thought. "Who has your affections? Tell me right now, or I shall scream." "You don't know him, Emma," I said. "I know everyone in Dunham," she replied with fire. I chuckled at that. "Please forget I said anything. I speak out of turn." "You're blushing, Harry. Good Lord, you've gone bright red." She looked to the garden, to where our sisters were tilling the vegetable beds, and yelled, "Mary, come here. I need you to help me wring a bit of information from our uncooperative sister." I scoffed. "I'm being silly. Never mind." "You're in love," she said. "I am not," I insisted. "Oh, I dare say you are," she replied. "There are more pressing concerns than a foolish schoolgirl crush," I insisted, squashing down the rising heat in my blood and trying desperately to forget last night's encounter. "Mr. Blackwood believes that the murderer lives amongst us, and that we can discover his true face if only we keep our wits about us." Emma, looking scandalized, swung her legs aside the Huntsman's Oak. "Who would be so diabolical? I mean, Earl Rabbit didn't deserve such an atrocious end. If I was to assign guilt, I might think Mr. Winterbottom would be a possible suspect, for an undertaker would benefit most from Earl's death. But no, I don't even think that likely." I took her hand in mine, studying the long fingers and graceful nails. Mr. Blackwood says that we've grown up near a font of unearthly power, and it has shaped us in ways we don't even recognize. Our quirks are the expression of that proximity. Perhaps someone else close to the library of Northwich Hall has developed a more malevolent quirk of their own. Who? Said Emma. Not Mamma and Papa, surely. No, I replied, but the Cripplegate farm is not so far away. What if Charlotte Cripplegate has a quirk too? Charlotte is kind-hearted. She would never hurt anyone, Emma replied, coming to the defense of her friend. In all the years I've known her, she never exhibited any strangeness. And you know how poorly Charlotte keeps a secret. She would have told me, I'm sure. I pondered over this, gazing down the road and across the shorn fields towards the Cripplegate home, with its friendly red door and its welcoming willow tree. I can think of no one who would make a suitable suspect, I said, more to myself than Emma. As we chatted, Papa headed towards us along the driveway. He wore his canvas hunting coat and a tweed cap. Girls, I'm heading into town to join the men, and we'll be looking for George and Teddy, he said as he passed. Mr. Poole informed me last night that a group will search the caves and canyons at the west of the country, and I'll be back before dinner. Let me come too, I said. Emma has restored my ankle. A walk would do me good. And me, said my youngest sister, although at her suggestion my father shook his head. Harry, you may come if you think you're up to the challenge, but Emma, your mother would strangle me if I was to put you in harm's way, he said. She's already informed me that she has high hopes for you, and plans on marrying you off to Mr. Blackwood within the month, if he has no further interest in Harry. Emma gave a mewl of disappointment, but I ran to the house to grab my boots and my shawl, and met Papa at the road in only a few minutes. We walked into Dunham and joined a small knot of 20 men at the crossroads by the church. Some were villagers, but most were soldiers. The elder Mr. Darling, Frederick, and Mr. Marsh could be counted among them, as were Mr. Chowder and Mr. Crumpsall, desperate for any news of his son. A sense of anticipation and anxiety ran high, and the emotions felt like the faint tingle of static electricity in the still air, and made the fine hairs of my arms stand on end. After the gaiety of last night, everyone was in a quiet and retrospective mood, and we followed the path along the river towards the east end of the county in contemplative silence. Well, they were contemplative. The whole way I schemed and plotted to keep them out of the caves. The last thing I wanted was this cohort of intrepid explorers to descend into the caverns and stumble their way to the Northwich cellars, and disturb Nate in his underground lair. Such a confrontation would go poorly for both parties. But this was never to be, for we didn't make it so far. A mile past the splintered ruins of the footbridge, Mr. Tippler held up a hand to bid us to stop. A light, silvery fog swirled between the alder saplings, pulled by the current of the waters. It created playful eddies in the air. "What is it?" said Mr. Darling. The old tinsmith held his ear high. "Not sure," he said. I strained to listen too. I hoped to catch a hint of Nate's passage, but there was nothing. "Carry on, friends," Mr. Tippler said, and began to walk forward. I was still listening as the cohort passed by. Mr. Marsh, who was last to pass me, said, "Will you come?" "In a moment," I replied. To my disappointment he lingered. "I hear nothing." "No, nor I," I said. "I would be remiss to leave a lady alone in the forest," he said with an air of gallantry. So Mr. Marsh was to be my chaperone, was he? "You do me honor to extend your assistance, but I'm quite accustomed to this countryside," I replied. "I assure you, sir, there is no need for concern." He remained unconvinced. I saw at once what Emma found appealing about him. In addition to a comely face, he had an alertness and boldness that did him credit. We began to walk again, and when I stumbled over a small rise in the trail, he took my hand to help me steady myself, and I was afforded a peek at his innermost core. Perhaps it was rude of me to pry, but Emma is my youngest sister, and I'm protective of those I love. In the barest second of our skin touching, I recognized him to be a very good soul, with honest intentions and a measured ambition. He was young and impulsive, yet intelligent and charitable. There was no sense of lecherousness or greed in his intentions. He was open and confident, full of hope, and had not yet suffered an occasion to doubt himself or fear failure. He seemed utterly devoid of cynicism. Emma had chosen to give her heart to a very fine fellow, and I hoped their friendship could be given time to nurture in a place not darkened by tragedy or death. "Yes," I said, more to myself than to him, "you'll do nicely." "I beg your pardon," he said. "From where do you hail, sir?" I replied. He gave a modest smile, made more attractive by his honest bearing. "Oh, not far away. My family is from Lower Watley, miss, and I grew up on the southern border of Dreadmore Heath." "Goodness, then we are neighbours," I laughed. Miss Emma was pleased to hear that we knew of many similar places, he said. Is she well today? Did she enjoy the dancing last night? Ah, here is the root of his gallantry. I grinned at his attempts to be subtle. She had a very good time indeed, I said, and spoke excitedly this morning about her spins around the dance floor. She danced with you, did she not? You have made an impression, sir. He looked bashful and charming. Will you extend to her my best wishes? Of course, I said, although I can already tell you she'll be jealous that I have spent a full conversation with you. May I suggest you come and dine with us at Lovecraft Cottage when this whole terrible event is concluded? I'm sure Emma will be thrilled to introduce you to our mother. God have mercy. He smiled as our paces brought us up to the group again, but his mirth cooled when we noticed that the group was no longer progressing along the trail into the narrowing fissure of the canyon. Instead, the men had stopped and silently stared up at the rock walls. Some were shielding their eyes from the sun, while others had covered their mouths with their hands. Mayor Chowder had retreated to the bushes and was loudly ejecting his breakfast into the weeds. "Good Lord, Harriet, do not come any further," said Papa in a rush, and his face had a green pallor, and his eyes were full of horror. But I looked past his shoulder to follow their gaze, and saw great slashes of red across the chalky white walls of the canyon. Common starlings had clustered over the rocks in vast and uncountable numbers. A conservative estimate would say there were thousands of them, and they twitched and flicked their brown wings like an undulating curtain of feathers, but they remained utterly silent, with not a tweet to be heard. They had thronged to the blood that had splattered over the embankment, and they pecked at this nourishment with a starved desperation rarely seen in songbirds. I took a step back, overwhelmed by the sight. Mr. Marsh kindly grabbed from my hand with his left, as if to impart strength to me, and pointed with his right. Look! At the top of the apex of the twin blood spatters, two bodies dangled from bramble vines, their heads almost severed from their spines by the length and violence of the drop. But it was neither George nor Teddy, the objects of our search, who hung like forgotten shanks of beef in the butcher's window, blanketed in songbirds that were voraciously pecking them raw. It took a full minute for me to recognize the sparse, skinny legs and thread-worn aprons, the gaunt and skinless faces now frozen in horrible, unblinking masks of death. Good Lord, I whispered, it's Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit. The rabbits are dead. The thought circled around and around in my mind as I made my way home, encouraged by the men to leave before the corpses were cut down, and accompanied by Mr. Marsh to ensure my safe arrival. We spoke very little, he and I. When we reached the militia's camp outside Dunham, he procured the use of a horse after relaying the news, and we rode home between the fields with me sitting before him, stunned into uselessness. "Have you ever seen so many birds all in one location?" he said as we plodded along Mill Road. His voice was thin with wonder. "No," I replied. "In fact, there's been a distinct lack of birds for the last few weeks. I'm happy to see that they've returned." "But with a hunger for human flesh," he replied. We said nothing more until we reached Lovecraft Cottage. Upon arriving home, I left him to share the news with Mamma and Emma. I ran as fast as my legs would take me towards Northwich Hall, where I pounded upon the door with such fury that surely I woke Cerberus in distant Hades. It took a very long time to see any hint of life within. The house was extremely spacious, after all. I guessed that the staff from last night had departed back to the city, shooed away by a grumpy employer who would want them around no longer than absolutely necessary. At last the latch clicked. The door opened. But when I stepped inside, I found the foyer empty. The ballroom was vacant too, so was the parlor, the sitting room, the library. But someone had unlocked the doors to let me in, so I returned to the main entrance. "Nate," I called, "are you here?" I didn't mean to sound so stricken, but my words came out in a quaver. At once I felt a tickle in the nape of my neck. It startled me, and I stepped back with my hands to my throat. One long tendril hung from directly above. My eyes followed it up to see Nate wrapped around the chandelier. He was a sinewy, seething tangle of constant motion, and colored gold to match the gilded fixture. When I flinched, he hesitated, so I took the nearest tentacle in hand. "No, I'm not afraid. I simply wasn't expecting you to come from over my head," I explained as he descended silently, and I felt the cool emotion of relief flood through his skin and into my fingers. "But I need to tell Thorn. I need to tell Thorn that there have been deaths in the village." The skin mottled into swirls of bright azure and indigo, a rush of surprise, and a question. "The rabbits," I answered, "the parents of the first boy." He dropped with a moist smack to the floor, and I realized there must be no bones in him to break, for his bulk squished flat before rearing back, and he drew himself up onto 6 of his legs. One tentacle wrapped itself around my waist, and he pulled me to the stairwell. Wait, I said, resisting. He stopped on the landing, and we stood together under the portrait of the woman and lambs. The amber eyes came close until they were on par with my own, showing unmistakable confusion. And surely he had no skull either, for his brow furrowed deeply, and his face contained more expression than any stiff, solid, unyielding bone could allow. I took a deep breath and said, I only wanted to say that I'm sorry I left so quickly last night, and it was rude of me to abandon you, especially after your half-brother was so vulgar to intrude upon us during our intimacies, and I wish I could have stayed in your embrace until dawn. I smiled slyly. All day I have thought of nothing else but you, Nathaniel Blackwood, you mysterious and marvelous gentleman. Then relenting, I added quickly, well, until I saw the rabbits, of course. Then I thought only of them, but that's understandable given the circumstances. He narrowed one eye. Honestly, I insisted, I'm neither horrified nor disgusted by you. I'm not afraid of you in the least. One tentacle wrapped around my body and pulled me closer, and the eyes stared deeply into mine, trying to root out any deception there. From his skin I felt, how to describe it, disbelief and hesitation, suspicion and trepidation. He did not believe me, but oh, how he yearned to. So I laid my hands on either side of his pulpous head and pressed a passionate kiss directly between his eyes, just below the white line of the little scar. I had always been a passive observer in the secrets of another's sensibilities, but this time I pressed my own fervor upon him, imparting through his skin the fullness of affection, fascination, and elation I felt at the smallest thought of him. My ardor was boundless. I wanted Nate to know my heart, all of it. But maybe I was too intense. It seemed that of late my quirk had grown in strength, and I had not yet learned to temper it. When we parted, he wobbled on his legs and looked a little stunned. I don't care in the least what body you wear, Nate, I whispered in possibly the general direction of his ear. I think you are an astonishing person, and I only wish to know you better. A tidal wave of exhilaration flowed through him, but there was no time to savor it. He wrapped me up in a mass of churning tentacles and slurping suction cups, and we flew up the stairs soundlessly, through corridors and staircases and halls, at the same rapid pace as a galloping horse. It wasn't until we burst through a large door into a circular room of tall, arched windows that I realized he'd carried me up to the top of the highest tower. The room had a diameter of 20 paces, and boasted a ring of tall arched windows that provided an unobstructed view to the north and east. A few eccentric contraptions built of brass and iron were scattered about the space. At first glance I mistook them to be weird sextants and absurd telescopes, the likes of which would send Emma into a joyous frenzy. But before I could examine them further, my attention was snagged by the stacks of books that littered the floor. Volumes of a mammoth size, some as big as a man's chest, towered in the corners. Still others were pamphlets as tiny as a baby's palm, as delicate as ginkgo leaves. A velvet couch with a floral pattern sat against an interior wall, but it had been rendered useless by the sheer number of books balanced upon it. In the center of the room stretched a long wooden table spread with rolls of parchment papers. Thorne stood beside it, wearing his outrageous 6-lensed spectacles on the end of his nose. As the door burst open and we exploded in, he turned and grabbed his chest as if he were about to suffer a coronary. "By Mithras's whip," he yelled, and he saw me and gaped. "Miss Lovecraft, what is the meaning of this?" "The rabbits are dead," I said, as Nate gently set my feet upon the ground. I attempted to pull myself together with as much humility as possible. My dress was askew, my hair was unpinned, and somewhere along the way I'd lost my shawl, my hat, and one of my shoes. But I stood up straight and tall and folded my hands before me. Both the baker and his wife were hung, or hung themselves, from the top of the canyon walls outside the entrance to the caverns. I do not know if it is suicide or murder, but I thought I must inform you immediately. If he was surprised, he hid it well. Thorne removed his spectacles and set them on the table. Then he strode to the window, thinking furiously, his hands clasped at the base of his spine. "What does it mean?" I pressed. "Were there birds?" Startled, it took a moment for me to answer. "Yes, hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. How did you know?" Thorne stared in contemplation out the window in the direction of the woods. I crossed the round tower room to stand beside him, and was instantly struck by the stunning view. One could see as far as the Barnacle Mountains, with their jagged square peaks and glittering snowcaps, shrouded in clouds. He turned to Nate. "Psychopomps?" he asked. "Have you ever seen an octopus shrug? It is a most remarkable thing. The expression ripples through tissue and muscle, and colors shift from dull matte to shimmering iridescence." "We must capture one then, and put the screws to it," Thorn replied. "If it is a psychopomp, then perhaps it will know the identity of our quarry." He strode back to the table, leaving me at the window. "You must catch one, Nate, if you can, and we'll look for evidence of its purpose. Neither Harry nor I have the dexterity or speed for the task, and I'm afraid will be of no use to you." Nate hesitated, then surged back down the tower stairs and disappeared. Thorn returned to his books, in particular a large leather-bound tome that appeared to have been written by a medieval scribe in a monastery, long since set ablaze by Vikings. He gave every indication that he'd forgotten completely I was here. "I'm sorry," I began, "but what, pray tell, is a psychopomp?" He finished reading his passage before addressing me. "Do you know... What do you believe happens to us after we die, Miss Lovecraft?" "I don't profess to know," I said. He grimaced. Oh, such modesty. He glanced down at his book and said, "Do you believe in a loving God?" I considered his question. "No," I said at last, "I do not." This surprised him. "I thought an upstanding lady like yourself would be a regular fixture in the pews of St. Dismas on Sundays." I shook my head. "My mother is a Bierce, Mr. Thorn, and they have long been known as agnostics. She does not profess to know the truth, and distrusts anyone who makes such a claim." I glanced once more out the window with its breathtaking vista and blue skies. "Against her better judgment, I've nurtured a friendship with Father Noonan, but it's rooted in philosophical conversations rather than sermons, and so she lets me continue." "Interesting," he said. "Tell me, Harry, why does God not love us, his creation?" I circled the table. "Because a God who loves us would not give us free will, then punish us when we use it," I replied. "If there is a God, it's despondent at best. We've been given free will to do as we please, and we will reap the rewards or suffer the consequences of our actions. God has decided to let us choose our own destiny, and stepped out of the room." "How progressive of you," Thorn replied. "Utterly wrong, of course." I blinked. "You cannot know," I said with a wry grin. "No mortal can." "That's true. A complete knowledge of the universe is beyond our frail physical capabilities. In that your mother is correct," he replied. "But you would be mistaken if you think the gods have no interest in the trials of man. They delight in it. We are here for their sport, Miss Lovecraft, and when they tire of us, they destroy us." He gestured to the open book on the table. "You've already seen the caliber of book in Posy's library. He wasn't the kind of man to be satisfied with a general reading list. He knew, as you may suspect, that the world is not exactly what we believe it to be. Humanity exists on a tiny ship that bobs helplessly on the surface of a vast ocean, full of secrets. We know the shape and contents of our boat, but we cannot see over the side, and we remain blissfully unaware of what lurks all around and under us, exerting constant influence over us, and plotting our demise." "Hardly comforting," I said. "Through Posy's collection we can catch the faintest glimpse of what exists beyond our boat, Miss Lovecraft. See, other travelers before us have recorded their own journeys, so that we may stand on their shoulders and look a little farther." He flipped open a page of the book. It was blank. "I see nothing, sir." "Of course not," he replied with exasperation. "Haven't you heard a word I said, Harry? Just because you lack the ability to see does not mean that nothing's there." Thorn took the spectacles from the table and hooked them over my ears and flipped the shimmering blue lenses down. Instantly, they revealed a dreadful scene painted in faded inks. I saw horrible lithographs of awful creatures. Some were shaped like men and some like snakes, and yet others like amorphous blobs with rows of oversized ivory teeth. Tiny birds flew in the corners, as if frantic to escape the riotous cacophony of demonic figures. I gasped. "How can this be?" "The hermitoscope allows us to see through our reality and into other versions of our place and time," he explained. "In another reality, lying atop ours like a palimpsest, a blessed scholar has written in his book, whereas in our reality, the scholar never bothered or was never able. You are looking at the same book, but another version. Do you understand?" Not exactly, I said, still drinking in the myriad of figures. A tragedy, he replied, neither pretty nor intelligent. At least you can bake a decent sponge cake, if your mother is to be believed. Thorn stepped back to let me gaze upon the bestiary, one form after another, until I noticed a figure in the corner that looked horribly familiar. There, I said, pointing to it, that's the one on the heath. And truly, the artist had drawn it perfectly. The rag-bound body, the emaciated limbs, the bone-white face. On this image, though, the eyes were missing. No, not just missing, but scratched out, as if the artist could not bear to leave intact the full force of that hypnotic gaze. He took the spectacles and followed my finger to the figure. You came upon this and lived, he said, astounded, and with all your wits intact. Well, Miss Lovecraft, perhaps there's more to you than meets the eye. His lips curled up in scheming, and he said, I should marry you myself just to keep you in my collection. A girl of your abilities could be handy to have in a situation. I flashed him a look of disdain as he handed me the glasses, but I decided to ignore the proposal. Tell me now what you see, he said as I hooked them over my ears, and he reached over to flip the green lenses down over the blue. Instantly the page was alive with motion. Lines appeared and disappeared, shimmering and snaking over the vellum. All of it moving, I said, and here, words appearing. And next to the heath monster, what does it say? I think it must be Greek, I said. I can't read. Wait, it moves. It is being written even as I watch. I looked over the rim of the glasses at Thorn in wonder. How can this be possible? All things are possible given enough time, he replied. But for you and I, time may be in short supply. Go on, Harry. What does it say? I think... Eidolon? Does that mean anything to you? But he removed the glasses from my face and turned away. The page emptied. It appeared as pristine as if it had never been used. What do the starlings have to do with all of this? I pressed. The ancients assured us that a psychopomp carries the soul to heaven. He looked again to the blank book. If there are thousands, then deaths are coming to Dunham, Miss Lovecraft, and in great numbers. That black and sinister tide under our little boat is rising, and the leaks in the shipboards are starting to appear, and if we are not very careful, this little county is poised on the edge of utter destruction. He paused. His eyes narrowed and focused on some dramatic, distant point. And then he looked at me and said, While we wait for Nate's return, can I interest you in tea? All right. That's the end of today's chapter. I'm heading off to have a cup of tea. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!